Thanks. Hi, good morning. I'm Rob Tercek, and today I'm going to tell you that reality is overrated. But before I get into that, you can find me on Twitter. It's Superplex. And I want to ask a question to the audience. I want to find out how people are feeling, particularly about VR. How many people feel optimistic about VR? How many people are excited about it? Great. There's a smattering of hands. That's good. That's what I would have expected from this group. Hope is the feeling that we're having, right? New medium. Some big opportunities ahead, maybe a chance to create the next huge medium. That's what they're talking about in the room next door. And when you see a chart like this, it gets you very excited, right? $75 billion industry in just 5 years. That's a very exciting picture. Now, I don't know where this chart is from. There's probably zero validity behind it, so we just don't know. There's your virtual reality experience for this talk. I know for every person that's excited, there's another feeling that people have, which is a feeling of fear. Feeling maybe of anxiety. This has been kind of a tumultuous year, and last year was no better. Kind of an up and down, right? The cycle of hope and fear that you have when you're launching a brand new medium in a space that no one's ever been in before. And I want to drill into that a little bit. So what we've seen is a sort of steady tempo since 2016 is this idea that virtual reality is way overhyped, and now the hype bubble is being burst. You could say we're in a hype recession. Some people have started to post snarky commentary about how VR is just like it's just like 3D TV, which is a very negative comparison, kind of an unfair comparison in my view. But then bad news, after E3 this year, even that core gamer segment that everyone was banking on, it turns out they're not that impressed right now with the level of the technology and the experiences they can get. And so headset sales have been lower than expected, content sales similarly. So it looks like there's a pullback in the hype bubble right now. It turns out when you ask people what they think about VR, most of them are just not interested. They don't think the content is really there. They think the devices are way too expensive for what you get. That's really not an unreasonable reaction. The devices do cost an awful lot of money. And it turns out that entertainment that makes you throw up is not very popular as well. So there's this possibility of motion sickness that really makes people hesitate before they throw down $800 for a VR device. The big issue and the real cause of the fear is that investors have started to pull back. There was tremendous enthusiasm in this space not that long ago. In 2016 is a big year for investment, but now investors have started to pull back. And so there's that feeling of fear, maybe even despair. Now you guys are all sitting there going, wait, where is he going with this? The point I'm trying to make is that whenever you launch something new, there's this cycle of despair, hope, elation, and then it goes back to fear and despair. You bounce back and forth in that space. I know this. I've been doing this for 25 years. So we've been hearing now that VR is dead, right? Because in the blogging domain, it never hurts to have a grabber headline like that. So we've seen this headline at several different places. VR is dead. Is virtual reality dead? You know, the thing about this phrase is that this phrase should be retired. I've been working in the media business for almost 30 years, and every medium has been declared dead by some blogger or another, beginning with print and music in the early 90s, radio and television. Then the mobile came along, so the web was going to be dead, and then it turns out, no, actually mobile apps are the thing that's going to be dead. So actually, you're in great shape if people are calling your medium dead. It probably means you're just before a great big boom in the industry. And for instance, television industry I started in the 1980s has been declared dead so many times. It's been going on. This is like the meme you cannot kill. If you search TV is dead, you will find millions of blogs that have had this headline. Everyone's trying to marshal evidence for the decline of TV, this inevitable demise of television that never seems to happen. It never actually comes. In fact, TV is booming right now. We have about 450 scripted shows being broadcast or streamed right now. 450 original scripted shows, the most expensive kind of television program you can make. That is an all-time record. Last year, more shows were canceled than all of the shows in primetime in 2000. So we have this extreme explosion happening. You could say TV is in its golden age, and yet the skeptics are out there saying television is dead. So when they tell you VR is dead, I think the rumors of VR's demise are greatly, greatly exaggerated. So here we go, back to hope again. Let me try to build on the hope angle a little bit to get you started here. So about 15 years ago, I brought some of the very first mobile games to the United States, and it's fun to see Jeff Lindsay in the audience. Jeff and I are veterans from that battle. These were the phones we had to deal with back in the early 90s. Not exactly what you describe as a great gaming experience on a black and white screen with all these buttons you have to push. It was a very tough industry back in 2001. It was a $0 billion industry. Today, $38 billion globally from mobile games. It is the largest segment of gaming. Actually, mobile games now generates more revenue than online games and and console games. So that's actually quite extraordinary. It came as news to me last year when it exceeded those two fields. Plus, mobile games grows at 22% a year, so it's actually outstripping the growth. It'll soon be half the revenue in the entire games industry. By 2020 for sure, it'll be 50% of the revenue in the gaming industry globally. That's a really big deal, but look at that time frame, 2001 to 2016. So it took 15 years to become a $38 billion industry. Tremendous momentum there, but it's a long haul. It took us 3 years just to get color screens on the devices, and look what a crappy color screen that actually was. We were all elated, like finally, but look at that screen. It's not like a really awesome gaming device. And so we were all in the mobile industry waiting for devices, very similar to what's happening in VR right now, where we're waiting for the right device to come along so we can build the killer experience on it. And in 2003, we heard rumors that Nokia was going to step up with this awesome device. And so the whole industry was like, yeah, Nokia, they're the leader, they're going to make a great thing. And here it is. This is the device they came out with, the famous Nokia N-Gage. Yes, I see people remember that. It was kind of the nadir of the early mobile days. Here we go, the despair moment again. It kind of looked like it had console-like features with the, with the toggle and the buttons in the right position and stuff, so it looked like it was aimed at gamers, but it had a lot of defects. It had a vertical screen, it had very small memory, very low processing power, so you couldn't really build a very rich experience on it. And plus, get this great feature, to change the game, you actually had to take the back off the phone and pull the battery out and stick in a different card. Like, seriously, that was not a great experience. The worst part about it, though, the very worst part about it was when you used it like a phone, which it was meant to be, also a phone, not just a game console. When you used it like a phone, you looked like a principal dork. They had this clever idea that somehow gamers wanted to show people that they had an N-Gage because it was cool, and so you had to use it like a taco next to your head. You couldn't use it like a phone. You had to hold it out. It was super embarrassing. No matter how big your N-Gage was, you had this awkward experience where people would look at you, and they would look at you kind of like you were a giant dork if you had one. So it was not a cool device by any means. In fact, here's my favorite picture. Here's a guy in the Museum of Failure at the Innovation exhibit, which cites the N-Gage as a gigantic failure of innovation, and he's showing the reason why, because you had to use it like a taco. You had to hold it out there to talk on it. It did spur one interesting little sort of side effect in the subculture of gamers, which was this idea of side talking. So for about 15 minutes in 2004, everyone was posting pictures of themselves using computer and gaming peripherals and holding them to the side of their head like an N-Gage. So maybe that was the one little cultural side effect. So the point, I guess, is that you looked like a dork. And by the way, Nokia was like the leader. Like, they were the coolest company in the world. You have to remember, backwind to 2003, they were absolutely the leader. The next phone they came out with was this one. No wonder these guys went out of business. You know, when you go to Finland today and you talk to people, they say Nokia was a great company, and it was Microsoft that destroyed Nokia. But that's just not true. Nokia destroyed themselves by making crappy hardware like this. And so it was their own damn fault. Now, I bring that to your attention because I think VR has this problem too. The fact is, you look like a dork when you use VR. You just do. We got to get past this factor. There is no picture you can find of anybody who looks cool using a VR unit. You look like a gigantic dork. Oh, except for this guy. This guy looks pretty cool. Like, he's all buff in his t-shirt, he's got the groovy tattoos on the side, he's got the mini fascist haircut and stuff. So he looks pretty cool, and he's in this godlike pose, right? Look at him, he's in that godlike pose. So no wonder they use this picture every time they're trying to market some event, or even when they're talking about VR is dead. This is like the most popular picture in VR because it's the only picture of anybody looking cool. Now the reality is most people who use VR today look like this guy. Remember this picture? It came out a couple years ago with the headline, "The Future of Humanity in One Photograph." That was this picture. That was the headline for it. And at first I thought, what a cheap shot. What a cheap shot. Come on, they got this guy, he's got 2 milkshakes because one's not good enough for this dude. Gee, that's really mean. They're really slagging off the gamer community. People always tend to do that. And then I noticed recently that actually this is not such an uncommon thing. In fact, you very frequently find pictures of people who look like that guy doing that kind of super passive thing. In fact, there are lots of these. There's a long heritage of photographs of people sitting in that exact same position in their VR experience. I think in a couple of years, it's not unsafe to predict that by 2020, when you get on an airplane, you know, today everybody's using like their mobile phone or their tablet on the airplane. I think in about 5 years, you're going to walk on an airplane and everyone's going to look like this as you go down the hall to use the bathroom or something. You're going to see literally the entire plane. Everybody's got their headset strapped on and they're kind of in their own little space. One of the problems is we don't really have great looking people doing VR. That's one of the reasons why everyone looks like such a dork. So what happens if you get somebody really great looking? Like, sure, you can imagine some marketing directors like, why don't we try a good looking woman instead of some fat dude wearing our gear? Maybe they'll look a little cooler. So they took this picture, and I looked at that picture and I was thinking, I'll bet the product marketing manager was like, you don't have to hold it like binoculars. But then I noticed the background and I said, wait a minute, I know where that photo was taken. That's in the British Museum, right? You know, right? You see that and you go, I know where that is. And in fact, she's standing on a staircase. This is the stupidest picture you could possibly take. Here's where she is. This is in the British Museum, and nobody can do VR on a staircase, because if you make one wrong move, you're going to fall down the stairs and break your ankle or break your neck. That's a ridiculously preposterous notion. In fact, the only thing that would be stupider than showing somebody using VR on a staircase is somebody like riding a bicycle with a VR headset on, but nobody would ever do that. Okay, let's move on again. Okay, so the point is, there has been tremendous amount of hype around VR, and now the hype bubble is being bust. We're in a hype recession. Everybody in the room is familiar with this chart because you've seen it 1,000 times. It's a staple of every VR conference. The idea of the Gartner hype cycle that begins with a new capability, new technology, and then there's a peak of inflated expectations, and then this valley of despair. They call it the trough of disillusionment. And then you grind your way up the slope of enlightenment to a point where you can actually finally have a business. What they don't say is how long that timeline is, and I want to spend a minute thinking about that. So some people have said that we're kind of working our way through. Augmented reality is still in the downslope, and maybe VR hit the bottom last year and it's kind of grinding its way up to the slope of the plateau of productivity. Well, perhaps. Notice there is no timeline here. Other people say, nope, that's not what happened. In fact, VR is an extreme example of the hype cycle, because look, it was crazy hype. The red line is the VR, the blue line is the normal hype cycle. And so the red line is, this crazy level of hype, and then this gigantic crash, because it turns out the only people that are really interested are just gamers, and even they're not that interested, as I pointed out, after E3 this year. So there's been kind of like this hype recession setting in. Part of it is, frankly, blog posts like this one that came out just last April. This is not a very long time ago, just over a year ago, in Business Insider, a tremendously credible publication. They predicted that Facebook was going to sell about 600,000 to 700,000 units of Oculus Rift, and as we all know, Facebook fell far short of that with Oculus, but in fact, across the board, all of the headset displays, all the HMD displays fell far short of predictions, far short of analysts' expectations, and that's one reason why the entire industry got whacked. There's been a pullback. So here we are back in despair. Every time I try to pull you over to hype, it turns out I can't do it because I get drawn back into despair. This is not news. I've been doing this for an awfully long time. I did this with satellite TV in the 80s. I did it with early computer games in the 90s, and then internet games in the early 90s, and then mobile video, and then mobile games, and so on. And throughout my career, I've noticed that there is this cycle of hope and despair in the early days as an industry figures out what it's doing, as the devices come online, as the content finally gets figured out, we figure out a business model. There's a lot of stuff to do, right? We're inventing an entirely new industry that never existed before. It's not something you can figure out overnight. And no matter the fact that today maybe technology moves a bit faster and hardware maybe gets built a little bit quicker and some of the problems are better understood, that's all true. So maybe that cycle will compress a little bit, but you are going to go through this period where you're bouncing back and forth between hope and despair. That's just the way it's going to be for quite some time. Look, don't take it from me. Take it from the folks at Unity who know this far better than I do. The folks at Unity said, well, where we are right now is in this gap of disappointment. The red line is expectations, the white line is where we actually are. And they say it's going to be at least 5 years before we come out of this gap of disillusionment or gap of disappointment. And again, nobody really knows how long that period will be. What we do know is it's going to take years. It's going to take you years and years and years. It's not a one-year problem. Like, this situation won't be solved by the end of 2017 or by 2018. We're going to still be battling through inadequate hardware. Now they're trying to get the peripherals to work right. We don't actually know what the exact perfect consumer experience is going to consist of, and so it's very difficult to be a game developer or somebody who's designing an experience in an environment that's that volatile. So hence, you are going to cycle between hope and despair for several years. So the question is, what are you going to do in that time frame? What are you going to do for the next 5 years before this industry actually gets it together? So I am a total believer in VR. I believe this is going to come. I also believe it's going to take about 5 years. The question is, what are you going to do in the next 5 years? I know the answer. I know because I've been there before with many other fields. The first thing is you're going to perfect your craft. And you see this happening already with the people that you know who are developing VR. You're going to perfect your craft. Every time a new peripheral comes or a new head-mounted display comes along, you're going to be the first ones to adopt it. Why? Because you have to. Because you have to. Immediately, the whole industry is going to shift. Every time a new mobile phone came out in the early days of mobile games, the entire industry moved. They gravitated toward that because that was where you could make the landmark experience, the standout experience, the thing that might just turn out to be the killer app. And so you are going to perfect your craft. The people who survive the next 5 years are going to come out with the absolutely best skill set honed through brutal competition. And that's why I can predict the second thing you're going to do. You are going to do whatever it takes to survive. Whatever it takes to survive. I noticed that in this past year, since 2016 till right now, 2017, 20% of the VR developers have shifted over to educational software. And a further 19% of them have shifted to marketing, whatever that might mean. You're going to do whatever it takes to survive. If you don't, your company's going to go out of business and you'll end up working for somebody who did do whatever it took to survive. So I can make these predictions with absolute confidence. And I have a third prediction for you. You're also going to use the next 5 years to learn from the masters. And no, those aren't the people in the room. Those aren't the people even in the VR game industry or broadly in VR in general. You're going to learn from the real masters. You see, there are masters of alternative reality out there. And they're really good. And they really know their stuff. But unlike everybody in this room and everybody at this conference and everybody in the VR industry, what they decided to do is a little different from what you did. You see, you made the fatal error of waiting for the hardware to come in the market. And it took years, right? We heard about Oculus years ago, but it took them a couple years to finally get the hardware out. And when it came out, it's okay, it's not great, right? That's a disappointment. So we've all been on hold waiting for hardware. But there's a whole other group of people, and it's a really big group, who said, forget the hardware. I'm going to use today's media, and I'm going to go see if I can make alternate reality right now, today. And these people have been tremendously successful. They have been unbelievably successful. They are creating an alternate reality using TV, radio, print, and mostly the internet to reshape our perception of reality. And we are going to spend the next 5 years studying those companies and learning what we can take away and apply to our craft when we create virtual reality. Of course, the master of this is the liar-in-chief, our current president. This guy is unbelievable. He lies about foreign policy. He lies about where U.S. ships are. He lies about his meetings that he's had. He lies about domestic policy. And the funny thing about Trump is that he has kind of got the press trained like a dog, right? He just throws these tweets out there. It's like throwing a ball, and the dog has to run and grab it. He's the president, right? So every time he says something, whatever it is, a brain fart, the press has to react to it, and it bounces around in the press for a while. So he's the master of distraction. He's actually brilliant at this. He's funny, too. I mean, even when sometimes he retracts a lie, he lies about it. So here he has, he's withdrawing the racist lie about Obama's birth certificate, and in the process blames Hillary Clinton, which was untrue. So he lies about a previous lie. And then, great, he actually positions himself as a victim when people pick on him for this perennial habit of lying. He's an inveterate liar. He's an impulsive liar. He can't control himself, and when people criticize him, he sobs. And this works for his base. He's their guy. He's their avatar. They don't care whether it's true or not. They connect with him. That's incredible power. He is a master of deception. He's great at it. But Trump is a symptom of a much bigger disorder that is sweeping through not just the U.S., but the entire world right now. And I'm going to get into that with the few minutes I have left. Now, we have always had fake news. This is not a talk about fake news. Fake news has always been around, but it used to be in the checkout aisle at the grocery store. And now it's kind of metastasized into the internet. It's across the whole internet. It's in your Facebook feed right now. So fake news is a thing that we've always had to deal with. We've had reality TV since the early 90s. MTV's Real World was the first show, right? That dates back to 1994. And so reality television, such as it is, has been around. Scripted reality, which is one of the weirdest names for any kind of entertainment you can think of, scripted reality has been around for almost that long of a period of time. And by the way, that's where this guy got started, right? That's where we created this monster, is through reality television. He got really good at it, and he understood you could program people's perceptions through using media. We've also had celebrities for celebrity's sake for a very long time in this country. We celebrate them. We love them. These are people who are famous for being famous. They've achieved nothing. So there's a kind of false currency there, false social currency there. And of course, we've also had these kind of crazy, kooky, right-wing media, radio jockeys since the 1980s. This is not a new phenomenon. But there is something new that's happening, and I want to turn your attention to this. So in 2011, I was the host of a show called This Week in Social Media. Jason Calacanis runs This Week in Startups, and he said, hey, you want to run this show, This Week in Social Media? I said, sure, let's do it. It was a good time to do a show like that because there was a lot of stuff happening with social media that was quite new. It wasn't just a way to share pictures of your kid's birthday party or anything. We had all kinds of social movements. This guy's Velcro Ripper, who is the documentarian who covered Occupy Wall Street. So I interviewed some really cool people who were using social media in interesting ways, and it was was very lively in that period. In 2011, you had beginning first in 2009 in Iran, the first social media revolution, and then that was followed by North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, and a number of other countries, the so-called Arab Spring. And then very close on the heels of Arab Spring, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement, which actually was connected through social media with the organizers in Egypt and Tunisia, so they were communicating with each other using social media. And this movement spread from New York City to 900 cities around the world in a matter of weeks. So social media was a very powerful engine to drive that. And then gradually it started to spread around the world, and it became kind of an expected part of the political discourse. For instance, in Turkey, in Taksim Square, there was a long protest that happened there. And in Hong Kong, for more than a year, you had protests on the streets as well there. And so we saw the emergence of something brand new that never existed using this new technology, social media. The idea that if you can connect everybody together, it can actually transform society. And the phrase we used to describe it was spontaneous, leaderless, self-organizing, autonomous networks. I know it's a mouthful. I know it's a mouthful. What this means is it's a political process without a party, without a charismatic leader. That had never happened before. Well, it used to be a mob, right, if you had a revolution, but this was organized, people self-organized through social media. And we really thought this was going to change the world. But we were wrong. We were wrong. The Twitter revolution failed. It was a colossal disaster. With the exception of Tunisia, not one of those revolutions has resulted in anything like a democracy. In fact, it's mostly resulted in more authoritarian regimes than existed previously. So the social media revolution was a failure. And we all know from history, from the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, what happens to a revolution that fails halfway through and doesn't result in a democracy. What happens is you go into a terror phase where people's heads start getting cut off. And this is, in fact, exactly what happened with the Twitter revolution. What happened after the Arab Spring kind of calmed down was that we started getting these really disturbing videos from the Middle East, videos of people's heads getting cut off, posted on YouTube. Now, this was novel and new. Nobody quite knew how to deal with it. And it spread very quickly. And so eventually the press caught on to this. They said, holy cow, here's a completely new use of media. We've never seen this before. These social platforms are perfect for the propagation of ideas, political ideas, but really grisly, sensational ideas. And these guys are great at it. ISIS is the master of the meme. They understand how to use Instagram really well and speak exactly to their target audience. They were recruiting people to their movement in the West, in the UK, the US, all over Europe, drawing them to Syria to join into their revolution. They were great at the Twitter hashtag. They were bombing Twitter frequently. They also use Facebook in novel ways. You'll notice here on the screen, these are two ISIS websites. One of them is from Indonesia, and the other one is from the Philippines. These are thousands of miles away from Syria, but they had homegrown groups in those regions who were setting these things up, communicating, recruiting. So these guys were masters of using social media for political purposes, to spread propaganda, to spread their perspective, to change people's perception of reality. They even hacked into the US Central Command's Twitter account and changed it into Cyber Caliphate for a day or two. So they were even able to kind of penetrate what we thought were our own defenses, our own defense system. And they started targeting US soldiers who were posted in the Middle East via social media. They would start to send persuasive messages to them directly. And finally, by 2015, this is pretty recent, right? 2015, just a couple years ago, we concluded that ISIS was actually winning the social media war. And it took us a while to figure out how to respond to it. And finally, the US figured out a way to use social media. They started to promote these sort of link bait things in social media that would cause people, ISIS members, ISIS commandos, to respond back on their mobile phones. And the US military was able to use the location data that was embedded in those messages to target smart bombs and blow them up. So we finally figured it out, but it took us years to get to that point. And frankly, we weren't very good at it. But what we're doing is we're weaponizing social media. We're turning social media into a weapon of war. And particularly, it is a propaganda weapon. And we're reshaping the way people perceive the world. This is not limited to ISIS. It started there, but it's actually spread around the world, to the Philippines. These are governments that are using social media now to propagandize, to shape people's perception. In both sides of the conflict in Israel and in the Gaza, on the Gaza Strip and also in Israel, you have social media is being harnessed by politicians to propose a point of view, to spread a point of view. Both sides of the debate in Kashmir, in India and Pakistan, are using social media to propagandize. North Korea has a Netflix channel that is basically like a 24-hour propaganda, streaming propaganda channel. The masters, the real masters of this, though, are the Chinese and the Russians. So the Chinese have a whole army of people who create social media, sort of fake social media accounts, and they use that to persuade opinion and actually to affect the outcome of elections in other countries. And what's very important to note, there's this paper was published last August, and it analyzed the 2 million people who are creating false, sort of fake news in China. And what you notice about it is their goal isn't to change people's opinion. Their goal is to confuse people, strategic distraction. It's to screw up conversations. It's the opposite of enlightenment. And it's also to seed some doubt. Because always our press is going to have to balance 2 points of view. And so it spreads a little bit of doubt around. So the Chinese then were able to mess around, for instance, in the election in Taiwan. They were able to bombard the message boards for people who are talking about Taiwanese independence. Millions of messages were bombarded and disrupted that discourse. The Russians are the greatest at this. Today, modern Russia is basically a kleptocracy run by their secret services. The former KGB officers are running most of the government and many of the businesses there. And they are brilliant at using propaganda through social media and through digital media. Propaganda wasn't really very effective in the past because the quality was really poor and our traditional media organizations could resist it, but that's no longer the case. Social media makes it very easy to propagate. And the United States has tried to respond. The fact is we are in the middle of a new Cold War. And this has been going on for several years, at least since 2011, maybe even longer than that. Social media has turned into a war front. You're hearing a lot about it in the United States right now, just about the 2016 election, but what the point I'm trying to make is this has been happening for at least 5 years before that election. That was the culmination of something. It wasn't the beginning of something. This has been going on for quite some time. So the Russians have figured out that Western democracies depend on information to operate. And so their focus is to disrupt those democracies, to sow some seeds of doubt in those democracies. So the weak spot is information. Propaganda spread through social media is a way for them to create doubt. And they have, there were some researchers in Finland who went over to Russia and conducted an investigation and found a sort of meme factory in St. Petersburg where thousands of people on the payroll of the Russian government are generating memes by the score. And these memes can be adapted in any language. So the so-called interference that we've heard about in the US election, that's not new. If you go to Estonia, if you go to Finland, if you go to Latvia, the countries that are right up next to Russia, they'll tell you this has been happening for years. The Russians have been trying to propagandize their way into the election, to skew the result, to create some seeds of doubt, to alter people's perception of reality. And so here in the United States, we hear, one side or the other is hiring people to create spam, to create fake news, to spread these phony memes and so forth. But the point at the bottom is it does look like Russia was involved in that process in some way. And it's a pretty big business. And so actually, in terms of, this is from last year, this is not recent, but this was spread around during the election. There was a thing that went up that said, hey, you don't have to actually go somewhere and vote. You can vote online. You can vote with your mobile phone. Just text Hillary to vote. What they're trying to do is suppress the turnout. You're going to see this turns into a very big issue in the United States as that investigation proceeds. And by the way, a VR pioneer played a principal role in the last election in creating these fake memes. So a lot of developers didn't like the fact that Palmer Luckey did this, and they actually withheld their development. They stopped doing development for Oculus Rift, and finally Facebook forced him out. But here's a guy who understands how to manipulate perception, right? He started in VR, and now he's moving into the meme factory business because he's like, hey, actually, that's a better canvas for me to get my message across. Now, it's not just propaganda wars. It's also, once you create a weapon and it gets out there, people start to use it in a lot of different ways. And so even legitimate elected politicians are guilty of manipulating perception through social media. I'll give you a great example. Remember in 2015, Charlie Hebdo, those attacks, right? Terrorists came in, they machine gunned these journalists and cartoonists. It was a terrible thing that happened. Big police battle in the streets. And hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets of Paris to protest or to demonstrate solidarity with France. It was actually kind of a beautiful thing, and everybody said, "Je suis Charlie." Right? You remember that? It was just a couple of years ago. And you probably saw this picture of all these leaders from Europe. That's François Hollande, the president of France, and he's surrounded by European leaders and other world leaders marching together. And it looks like they're at the head of that big march on the street. And you go, gosh, isn't that cool? Like, they led this gigantic march, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Paris. And so, of course, people picked up that photo and they tweeted it and they shared it and they said, kind of an expression of solidarity through social media with France. They were like, isn't this great? Look, the whole world is coming together to unite in support of France. And then people started to find out that actually that photo was fake. What happened was they lined up all those world leaders on some streets that were a few blocks away from that demonstration where all those marchers were. And these were streets that were blocked off and secured, and they took the photographs and faked the photographs to make it look like they were walking in front of people. And so they crashingly disappointed people. And of course, that news ricocheted through social media very quickly. Now, normally we have press that covers this, but we've been degrading our newspapers and press and journalism in general for the past 30 years. And so if you talk to any journalist, they'll tell you about the layoffs, the cutbacks in the newsroom, the cutbacks in a number of different ways. So credibility credibility in media is at an all-time low. This is not just an American phenomenon. This is happening worldwide. But here we have it in the United States, all-time low credibility for our journalists, who should be the watchdogs of fake news. What's happened is we cut back so much now that we, instead of having camera crews, we send somebody out with a smartphone. And so, you know, the distinction between a professional journalist and a blogger, that distinction is being eroded by budget cutbacks. We've also cut back on fact checkers. And so we tend to publish stories, and you're seeing this more frequently now, where you have to retract the story the next day. Just last week, CNN had to fire 3 reporters because a story was published without proper fact checking. So this is a real issue, right? We're cutting back in the newsroom in a big way. A good example of this is right before the election in October, you might have heard a rumor flying around in right-wing media that Hillary Clinton was going to send a bomb to blow up. She was going to send a cruise missile to blow up Julian Assange. Now, Julian Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. We're not in the habit of bombing embassies with cruise missiles. But this idea was started by it was actually a sarcastic post that was published by a blogger that was picked up by other right-wing blogs and gradually filtered its way up into the conservative media stream, even on Fox News. And so stories that kind of start in the blogosphere and they kind of find their way into mainstream journalism. We don't have the proper fact-checking in place to vet this stuff. And there's a lot of money behind it. What we know is anger drives clicks, and clicks drive revenue. And so we've seen this happen, particularly on the right in the United States. So PR is killing journalism. This is a tremendous trend. As we've been firing all these journalists, where do they go? Where do they go work? What happens to the journalists who are getting laid off when newspapers close or when they trim back? Well, it turns out they go over and work for PR firms. PR firms, according to the Financial Times, for every journalist in America, there are 4.6 PR people. Many of them are former journalists themselves. And on average, they're paid about 35% more than a typical journalist. So actually the money's better. And there are bloggers out there who are saying, come to the dark side. Literally, I've seen these blogs. Come to the dark side and work for us. They're recruiting journalists out of the professional journalism into the PR and publicity field. It's no surprise where they're working. If you take the issue of global warming, you never get total consent or no total agreement among scientists on any issue, but we have the closest thing to global agreement among scientists is the fact that there is climate change happening right now. But yet there's always this story that there's a group of people who think it's not happening and they can deny it and so forth. That is 100% financed to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year by corporate interests, particularly in the energy and the fossil fuel industry. That's not the only group that does it. Our telcos here have kind of astroturfed with fake protests, fake bloggers, and so forth. Even the egg industry came out and spent tens of millions of dollars to degrade a vegan alternative to mayonnaise. So this is this is the kind of money that's being spent to create false reality that's spread through traditional media. Here's a great example that came out on Sunday. Vitalik Buterin, he's the guy who created Ethereum. He's a leader in the cryptocurrency movement. This was posted on 4chan on Sunday this week. It said Vitalik Buterin is confirmed dead and insiders are bailing out on Ethereum. And it wasn't true. But look what happened. So in a 9-hour span between when that thing was posted at about midnight or 9 o'clock, it dropped a tremendous amount. About $4 billion of Ethereum was wiped out. So some people made money on that transaction. Some people got into Ethereum very, very cheap. And Vitalik Buterin had to do an interesting proof of life the next day to prove that he was still around. He actually posted this thing where he wrote down some code from the latest block of the blockchain. So this is a new way to prove you're still alive, I suppose. Interesting notion. But that's how he countered that fake message. Our young people are particularly susceptible to this because they get their news from Facebook. That's not news to anybody. Ev Williams, who started Twitter, described it as junk food. He said we just give people junk food in social media and that's what they respond to. Some people are really critical of Facebook's role in all this. Facebook has had this huge fake news problem. They're trying to fight it right now, but it still persists. You see that in your own news feed. So for people who don't believe in liberal media, they're getting a lot of reinforcement for that belief. A lot of people are critical and suspicious of our media. And you could say that actually commercial media has abdicated its responsibility here. I think that's the case. Not just with budget cutbacks. The race for ratings, the race for revenue causes our commercial media to do some outrageous things. Do you remember when the Malaysian Airlines airplane disappeared in South Asia? Remember that? It was just a couple years ago, but I know we get instant amnesia now with all the news that comes along. Do you remember CNN's coverage? Because I do. It was unbelievable. So you had this tragedy, an airplane disappeared, nobody knew where it was, and so CNN started to just run this airline story again and again, 24 hours a day, and they started to bring in more and more extreme points of view. First the question, was it a zombie plane? What the heck is this? This is CNN. This is supposed to be like the gold standard of American journalism. And then they brought in people who were talking about whether it disappeared into a black hole or the Bermuda Triangle. They even had a panel of psychics on CNN. Psychics. I was watching them. I'm like, this is unbelievable. This is CNN. This is not some like an alternative news channel or something, they put out this survey where they asked if space aliens, time travelers, or a being from another dimension may have hijacked the airplane. This is CNN. Jon Stewart's reaction. And even Fox had a field day with this. This is great. Fox News was questioning the credibility of CNN. Some people say, gee, we're actually starting to deconstruct the only tool we have to verify reality, science. And some people lay the blame for this on the GOP, the Republican Party here in the United States. They say there's a war on science. Other people say it's the liberals. Other people say the Democrats are against science. They're having a war on science. Whatever, whoever's behind it, it's working. It's working. Americans are suffering from an epidemic of ignorance. I think this is probably true in other countries. I don't know it, but I can tell you for certain. We have an epidemic of ignorance. Every survey that tests American for basic knowledge of how our government works, they have no idea how our government works. They don't know what the Constitution is. They don't know what's in the Constitution. And now that we're coming up to the 4th of July weekend, I thought you'd enjoy this.
What country famously broke away from England to start their own country in the late 1700s?
I have no idea, man. I don't know.
What are we celebrating on the 4th of July?
Our independence.
A little more specific.
It's the day that we overtook the South. And it's the day that, it's our independence. That's why we have the fire.
From the South.
From the South, exactly.
So it was the victor of the Civil War?
Yes.
4th of July?
Yes.
The Declaration of Independence was signed by who?
I don't know.
Just name one person.
Abraham Lincoln? I don't know.
Sorry.
Not?
What year was that Declaration of
Was it
Independence?
1964?
1984.
84? I don't know.
Okay. So unfortunately, Americans have no clue. 1 out of 4 Americans believes that the sun revolves around the earth. Half of Americans believe in medical conspiracy theory. Americans believe that vaccines cause illness. Are we getting the high sign to finish?
I'm afraid so.
Give me a minute, one more minute, I'll wrap it up fast, I promise. 16 million Americans believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows. People are proud to be ignorant. In a desire to get to the end, let me talk about what's happening. We have a culture of deception. Companies are making software that lies. Companies are building whole businesses, raising billions of dollars on lies and deceit. Even our police force and FBI are using lies. And it's going to get worse because now anybody can alter any image or any sound. They can actually take your voice recording, produce new video. Some people say it doesn't even matter. Reality doesn't matter. So 2016 word of the year was post-truth. That's the era that we're in. And for the people in this room, you're going to make some tough decisions with big, big consequences. It's not about alternative reality or virtual reality. It's about low-fidelity reality. We're building models, software models, that omit crucial parts. Software models are basically opinions about what the coder thinks is important, and we leave out everything else. And those software models now operate in the real world. They have real-world consequences for people. And so reality, virtual reality or real reality, turns out it's a choice. It's a decision that we make. It's a hypothesis that we test with our own equipment. We don't use science to verify it. It's an agreement among a group of people, consensus reality. And it ends up being a tribal identity for those who share it. That's powerful stuff. And I urge the VR community to use your powers wisely as you come out of this cold spell the next 5 years. Robert Tercek, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for the extra 5.